Welcome to Season 3 of In the Lead with UCEA. I'm your host, Mónica Byrne-Jiménez, Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration. In this podcast, UCEA presents pivotal conversations with people making an impact on educational leadership preparation, practice, and policy. Learn about the latest happenings and cutting-edge research from UCEA's community of scholars. This season, we are diving into how the Wallace Foundation helps communities build more vibrant and just futures through research in the arts, educational leadership, and youth development. In particular, we'll be talking with the foundation executives and authors of recent reports on educational leadership. Ellen Goldring is Patricia and Rhodes Hart Professor of Educational Leadership in the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations, and Vice Dean in Peabody College of Education and Human Development at Vanderbilt University. Her research interests focus on the intersection of educational policy and school improvement, particularly within educational leadership. She is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, past vice president of AERA's Division L, Policy and Politics, and recipient of the Roald F. Campbell Lifetime Achievement Award from UCEA. She led the study of the implementation of the Wallace Foundation's Principal Supervisor Initiative, a district reform initiative that aims to revise the role of principal supervision in urban districts. She is also the co-principal investigator on the role of assistant principals, evidence and insights for advancing school leadership, funded by the Wallace Foundation. Welcome, Ellen.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Monica.
Yes, let me just fangirl for a little bit here. You know, it's great to have you here. When I saw the report and read the report on the assistant principalship, I was just so excited and fascinated about the topic, about the things that you found. And so having you here to talk to is just such a treat.
Well, it's my pleasure. We are so excited about the work and the findings and just how many unexpected findings and areas for further investigation and discussion that the report raises. We're very happy to be here to talk further about it.
Great. Thanks so much. So let's just dig in. And if you could talk a little bit about where was the initial sort of motivation to explore really this overlooked position in educational leadership in schools? What made you go there?
Yeah, it's really interesting that there has been so much attention on the principalship. And of course, we know that there's a pathway into the principalship and that many principals go through the assistant principalship. But the literature was quite thin in articulating what that really means, how many assistant principals there are, and what the role can entail. And in fact, as we found in the report, we were kind of hypothesizing that this is an area that really needed much further discussion and edification about, like, what is this role? It's there, but what is it? So it really was just kind of like a fact needing some attention that we wanted to dig in deeply.
Yeah, no, definitely. And sort of, you know, the assumptions that every school has an AP, and yet we know very little really across the board about their roles and how it's changing and what we need to do to support them. So I think your report was, again, so exciting and just so timely. And I think if we can start talking a little bit about what you actually found, the report does highlight the increasing role and increasing complexity of the role of assistant principals across the country. So what were you able to find around how the role has changed over years, and how have their leadership or their tasks changed in that time?
So I think the first thing that was just really, really surprising, and we had no idea using national data, was the extent to which the number of APs has increased over time. I don't think anyone anticipated that, or certainly we didn't. So the first thing that we found is, wow, this is a role that's being implemented in schools more and more. And in fact, we estimated that the APs have grown more than 6 times as fast as the number of principals.
Wow.
Like from 1990 up to 2015. So that's a fact trying to tell us something.
Mm.
So that's one thing that we found. And of course, corresponding to that, therefore, many more principals have prior experience as an assistant principal. So when you juxtapose those two things and we think about the current challenges facing districts in terms of leadership shortages, having principals ready to do this increasingly complex job, this raised a lot of questions about how can we think about the AP role really as an apprenticeship or a stepping stone into the principalship. So that's one whole area that we really spent some time talking about.
Right. Were you able to see or find or hypothesize why there's been this dramatic increase in the assistant principals?
Yes. So, not very much in the report, because, of course, in the report, we just unearthed the fact. But since that time, my colleagues and I are looking into a few urban districts as more in depth case studies where we're able to first question whether these patterns seem to be consistent and can we replicate them in district level data, and then also do mixed methods where we're able to ask why. So we have a couple of hypotheses. Some of them are beginning to emerge. These are preliminary findings, but a lot of it has to align with, this is our working hypothesis, around the complexity of schooling.
Mm.
So as schools are facing more demands and more needs in terms of meeting the needs of diverse communities, children at risk, communities at risk, and also longer school days, more, I would say, expectations around social emotional learning, mental health, safety, all of these things. The general idea is having more adults in the school from the time that students step foot on the bus in the morning to the time they leave after school activities in the afternoon. There's more capacity to interact with and meet the needs not only of children, but of their parents and the community. So think just more hands on deck is one way to think about it. Now, that might not be the best way to think about it in terms of preparation for the principalship. That's a different question.
Right.
But just why is having more capacity in school leadership on a school campus? I will also note that there are many more schools that have more than one assistant principal. So that's also in our report. So it's just not that more schools have APs. That's one fact.
Mhm.
But there are also more schools that have more than one AP to address those complexities and to think of how to maybe consider smaller sub-organizations within a school, like by grade level. There's different schools that have schools within schools, lots of different organizations.
Right.
But how assistant principals are being assigned and deployed is also a big question that we're exploring further that came up in our report.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's fascinating, right? So on the one hand, schools have, increasing complexity, the need for increased supports for children, teachers, and communities, leading to the need for more, as you said, sort of more hands on deck, right? So that's one thing that's really a fascinating finding, I think, from your study. And then I think the other one is if you could talk a little bit more about how the nature of the role has evolved. I think in many schools, APs do the busing or they do administrative things. And so
Yes.
has that changed at all? And in what ways?
Yes, so I think it's hard to talk about the typical AP as we're learning and digging into this more. And we see this in the data in the report. In other words, there's a notion of kind of the general AP, and this would especially be probably the case if a school only has one AP,
Right.
where they are picking up and doing lots of different duties, including administrative duties. And the literature primarily talks about student discipline,
Right.
but we think, and this is a point in the report, the literature review suggests that that's probably overemphasized, that assistant principals do student discipline, because As we know, student discipline doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it could be, and I think in many ways it is, much more related to the instruction of the teacher and how the teacher is being mentored and supported to engage students in teaching and learning, and how the students are being addressed in the classroom. So separating out student discipline as separate from mentoring of teaching and coaching of teaching is a little problematic. So one of the things we talk about a lot in the report is how are we conceptualizing and how do we think about roles when there's so much interconnection in practice, and we might want to think about a little bit differently. So there's administrative work for sure. And then the literature talks about administration, student discipline, instructional leadership.
Right.
But I think how those terms are defined are very different. And I think in practice, we can see much tighter connectivity between the roles of assistant principals and supporting teachers and students than these subcategories may suggest.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's like just such a great finding. But I think back to my days as a classroom teacher, right? Like it's the relationship with the AP that was able to either help me in the classroom or with students or even with busing. So the level of their relationships with teachers and students, I always found to be a strength of the position that, again, we don't often talk about.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's why I think the term, again, this from the literature, that almost like the assistant principal is the disciplinarian in the school,
Right.
and teachers send kids to assistant principals. I think that's overstated for today.
Mhm.
You asked about how the role has changed. I think when schools were smaller and less complex and maybe more homogeneous, you could imagine that kind of approach.
Right.
But I do think when we think about the role today and actually talk to assistant principals and principals, it is much more about building relationships with the students and their caregivers, adults, families, and communities, such that that relationship and understanding can really support the teacher and the student in a much more holistic way
Yeah.
than these categories of roles might suggest.
Right.
And that contributes, I think, to the understanding of why we have so many more assistant principals, because there's a sense that we want someone from the school administration to be accessible, available, to help address the students and their needs and the teachers and the needs before they turn into intractable problems.
So a lot of really fascinating leadership development in the AP level, right?
Exactly. Yes. Perhaps there should be.
Right, and we haven't quite thought about it, which is one of the things that you pointed out in the literature that you looked at. Shifting just a little bit, one of the things that you also talked about in the report were the disparities in succession advancement from the AP position to the principal position, particularly among educators of color and women.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you found and what some of the implications of that are?
Yes. So some of the patterns that we have found and we note in the report is that there are increasingly educators of color that are moving into the assistant principalship role, but at least in the data and the time frame of the data that we had, we did not see that necessarily then translated into increasing diversity amongst school principals. And I think this relates to a couple of questions, and we hypothesize about this, whether there's bias, implicit bias, barriers, this whole notion of encouragement, tapping, sponsorship, of movement from the assistant principalship to the principalship, questions around what are the mechanisms for selection and development. And there is research emerging, some of it we're doing here at Vanderbilt, that's looking at the types of experiences that assistant principals have. So this gets back to the role. Are assistant principals who aspire to the principalship given opportunities to show leadership and participate in leadership in all the domains that are necessary to move into the principalship? Is there implicit or explicit sorting happening there. So I think there's just a lot to uncover in the data. I want to make another point related that we make in the report as a question. When we wrote this report, we received a lot of support in presenting this to various professional associations about acknowledging that the assistant principalship is also a crucial leadership role in its own right.
Right.
And we have been interviewing assistant principals, and many do not aspire to the principalship. They love their role,
Yep.
and they want to develop and be leaders of assistant principals in their district.
Right.
Novice, mentor, coaching. So I do think that's another quandary for the field,
Right.
but also for local districts to consider. How are people challenged, developed, and mentored and supported and grown in their leadership position, but without saying something that if you're not moving, and I'm not saying these patterns aren't important, they're very important
Right.
to understand and ensure that there's equity and opportunity. But I also think it's important that it's a very crucial leadership role. And in fact, with the way that we're conceptualizing it kind of as this relational hub of support with student and teacher engagement, it may even be elevated in its importance.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm so glad you said that because, again, I even think about my own experience in New York City. And, the assistant principal was really a revered leader in the community. The APs didn't want to move into the principalship because
Exactly.
a lot of times that meant they'd leave the school and they wanted to stay with their school and their community. And then on the flip side, they were often the consistency. So they would have changes at the principal level, but the assistant principal was the one that kind of offered that leadership consistency over time. And so I think the possibilities of absolutely thinking about the AP as sort of training for the principalship, but then also thinking about the AP itself as a crucial leadership role in schools.
Yes, and especially now as the principal role might be shifting post-pandemic to
Mm,
the need to address a lot of other things in the context of schooling.
mm,
I do think there's a real opportunity to help think through how assistant principals and principals work together as teams. And not only, right, we have instructional coaches. There's other leadership roles, and depending if there's department chairs or division heads and dean of students, for example. I
mhm.
mean, one question we were asked a lot is where are deans of students? And it's hard to know because different districts code, if you're thinking about
Right.
administrative data, code different things, and there's some decisions to be made there. But I just think it's an exciting time to ask ourselves, what are the roles and responsibilities of assistant principals? How can they best support their schools without necessarily saying, oh, well, you've been in that role too long, and that somehow reflects on you. And we've received, as I said, a lot of positive feedback of acknowledging, but also raising the importance in the spotlight of the assistant principal role.
Yes, and I think, like you said too, sort of the schools post or whatever COVID, we are going to continue to become complex organizations, and so really thinking about how to build on the strengths and the leadership that exists in the building from what happens in the classroom to the assistant principal, I think is really going to be key in helping us understand how to keep schools improving.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you sort of answered that question I had. So my next question, I guess, in terms of also sort of thinking about a little bit of the future and based on what you've done so far around the assistant principalship, like what should we be thinking about developing people for the assistant principalship? So even in our programs, most of us think of ourselves as preparing principals, but not too many of us think about, well, how do you develop assistant principals? So I'm curious as to what do you think we can do to better prepare assistant principals?
That's, I think, perhaps the most important question. And I think it relates to a new vision
Mm,
for leadership in schools, not only roles in schools. And so I think there's two parts that I have been thinking about in terms of that question. One is more as a developmental perspective. So one of the things that we haven't talked about that came out in the report is the extent to which most states evaluate assistant principals on the same rubric as principals, and how that's handled is very variable. Some districts say, well, if you're assistant principals, you can't be exemplary because that's only for principals. So you're starting out and you get to a certain threshold. Others include the assistant principal in the principal's overall school evaluation. It depends on the rubric. And what is often the case, though, in both of these scenarios is how misaligned feedback and evaluation is for assistant principals to the work that they're actually doing. So why am I bringing that up now? I think there's also very few states, and we talk about this in the report, that have differential licensing and differential certification processes. A few do. We have no research on whether these differential certification processes or licensees somehow bring a different outcome or more people into the profession, or it's developmental. So that's a whole area that needs work. But what I think is important is that we consider the unique roles and responsibilities that assistant principals do that are distinct from principals. And this gets into the pipeline work.
Right.
So in addition to assistant principals, I've been doing work with the Wallace Foundation on principal pipelines or pathways to the principalship. And it's interesting because when you look at the domains of the pipeline, the traditional domains, assistant principals aren't specifically noted. That term isn't specifically as a pathway. Yeah. And we have this big finding in our report. Although almost all principals start their first leadership position as assistant principal and they obtain certification and enter as assistant principal, as you noted, there are principal preparation programs.
Right.
So I don't have the answer, but I think there's a misalignment and a misconception because we suggest some things in the report. So for example, imagine if the time as an assistant principalship was actually considered part of a residency. Think about the medical model, part of a stepping stone or a residency for principal preparation. And one was actually prepared and developed to implement, align with roles and responsibilities as an assistant principal, knowing that you also had a principal and coaching and things happening in the system. And also aligning that with an ongoing feedback progression of evaluation and mechanism. So there would be some stepping stones to the principalship. Now, the problem with that is not everyone who's in AP wants to be a principal, right? But you could think about career tracking in a positive sense.
Right.
So I'm going to summarize because it's kind of complicated and maybe not even clear what I said, but can the time as an assistant principalship be considered a residency and formal preparation for the principalship rather than you get this certification and then your assistant principalship, which is theoretically disconnected from the preparation programs.
Right.
And is handed over to the district, but not in an aligned partnership way to prepare for the principalship. And also, some people are assistant principals for a year or two, and some are for 7 and 10 years. It just kind of depends. So how that all fits and where the pipelines fit in is there are many districts that have innovative, distinct academies for assistant principals as a first step.
Right.
And they are recruiting assistant principals specifically. And I think there's a lot to be learned. And then we can circle back as a field and say, where does certification fit in licensing?
Right.
It's not clear to me where in that progression that needs to be there as well.
Yeah, and that's quite a quandary.
Yeah, it's very complicated, but there's some good thinking that's happening and some innovation in the pipeline space that I think we could learn from and consider.
Yeah, and I mean, I think absolutely. And I think the spotlight that the report puts on the assistant principal, that we're even talking about the assistant principal, I think is a step forward. You know, the way that you sort of frame this is let's talk about school leadership in addition to just school roles would also go a long way in helping us understand the assistant principal, but then also think about that as a distinctive leadership tool or lever in schools and in school improvement.
Yeah, because I have a little bit of a future hypothesis that I think more and more, given the complexity of schooling and issues around resource allocation and scheduling and budgeting, on the positive sense, because we know those things really matter for the opportunities to learn that children have, and also the complexity of the community and the politics and crisis management, unfortunately. I'm just wondering what are the newer roles? I think maybe that it's time that we had a summit or some way of thinking about
Right.
that. And I don't think it needs to be uniform. I think every
Right.
school and every district has a lot of different contexts, but also different resources and different sets of leadership opportunities in those schools.
Yep, absolutely. Ellen, I could keep talking about this. I thought this report and everything that you all looked at and found just had so many interesting questions, not just for the role itself and for what's happening in schools, but in your future research, because we know there's more that we don't know about that role and that leadership than we do.
And I'll just say yes. And what was so interesting is how many research reports and papers put together all leadership, like school leadership was APs and principals. So
Right.
I think we actually probably know a little bit less than we thought, because in many times we couldn't disentangle, which is a finding in and of itself.
Right.
But I do think there's a lot more to consider because of that as well. The research base was not as robust because we couldn't always tell who the results were referring to, generalizing to.
Yes, yes. So lots more to learn about the AP position and their leadership. We'll have a report available to you on the Wallace website and UCEA's website. And then we'll have to do some more noodling on this together and come back and see what we can do to develop APs.
I would love to.
So thank you so much, Ellen. It's been great talking to you. And we look forward to what you come up with next.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll be in touch.
In the Lead is produced by University FM. We'd like to thank the Wallace Foundation for their support of this podcast, and you, our listeners, for your commitment to improving educational leadership and policy to create equitable, ethical, and socially just outcomes for each child.